Hey there, and welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast. I'm your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about knowledge gaps in politics and how they get exploited. Today is, in some sense, a little bit of a change in gears in what I typically talk about. It's a little less focused on data and explaining political topics like how a certain government function works or how it's structured. One of the driving reasons for why I do what I do, this whole nonpartisan civics education focus, is the desire to close political knowledge gaps among the public. But that's not just for the general populace. I have my own knowledge gaps to close, as do other people involved in politics in some way for a living. We all have gaps in our knowledge, even about things that we know a lot about. We're all ignorant about something when it comes to politics, even when it comes to topics we are well versed in. All of us think we know more about politics than we actually do. There's just too much info that's out there. And unfortunately, these gaps in knowledge and understanding get exploited by people who have vested political interests, be they partisan or ideology or issue based, or simply they want money in some way. And every single one of us, if we aren't careful, can be susceptible to manipulation tactics, especially if you think you can't be manipulated. Well, yeah, you certainly can. We all can, because we're all human beings. Even if we are careful, we can be easily swayed. And it may not even be deliberate manipulation by somebody who's doing the exploiting. They could just be that utterly convinced that they have everything figured out and that you just need to see the light. But it's still exploiting ignorance, a lack of understanding, and biases for political gain. So, what are the ways that we can be manipulated and exploited for somebody else's political victory? This is like many other topics we talk about, one that we can go on and on and on about for hours, days, weeks. But of course, to make it digestible, I'm going to boil down to just several basic subtopics going into how our knowledge gaps about politics get exploited. And they're all interrelated, they're not mutually exclusive, and why these cause such problems for us. So, fun stuff today. Here we go. So, exploiters. Who are they? This is the term I'm going to use for throughout the episode. I'm going to use the general term exploiter to describe people who use knowledge gaps in the public to their advantage. They exploit these knowledge gaps for their political gain. Maybe they're trying to win an election that they're running in. Maybe they're a campaigner for a candidate and they're trying to win that election for their candidate. Maybe they're trying to get a ballot measure passed that they have a vested interest in. Maybe there's just a general political victory where they're trying to own the other side and tell them what's what. And these people tend to be very polarized in some way. Not always, but usually they're one-sided. They really just see things through one specific lens. They're convinced that they have everything figured out and that their worldview explains everything. Nobody's worldview explains everything, but there are some people who are utterly convinced that, no, yeah, I know exactly how the world works. And it's a very frustrating attitude that people have. But unfortunately, it is a thing you see quite commonly in politics. And make no mistake, though, these exploiters can be all across the political spectrum. Now, who exactly are these people? I have my own opinions on who some of these people are, but true to my typical way of trying to address things, I try to keep my opinions out as much as possible. So I'm not going to single out any individual or groups. I'm very reluctant to name specific people or groups in general. You and I might think the same people are exploiters. Maybe we have complete opposite feelings on who the exploiters are. Maybe there's some agreement and some disagreement. I think there's plenty of exploiters out there, but I don't want to focus on specific people. Because trying to keep my bias out as much as possible because I have them just like everybody else does, and we'll get into biases specifically in a minute, or in a moment. But there would also be disagreement from listeners as to who I think is an exploiter anyway, and that's just going to derail the point. They're just going to get focused on the fact that you disagree or I disagree with who exploiters are. So this is just a very generic exploiter person. They're not going to single out anybody. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's go on to the very first subtopic I want to talk about of how people exploit knowledge gaps in the public. And I'm going to start off with the concerning power of our biases, because that's the most sensible starting point. It's much of what our knowledge gaps are based in. Everybody has biases. The differences lie in whether we recognize our biases, knowing how to check and counteract our biases, and recognizing why other people have the biases they do. So when we recognize our biases, do we know, okay, I tend to favor this party, or maybe I don't favor a party, but maybe I tend to favor this individual. Maybe I tend to favor this group. Maybe I tend to favor this ideology or issue stance. And that's a bias. It's not necessarily wrong that you support any of those things or people, but it is a bias. So do we know that we do that, or are we convinced that, oh well, our bias is fact? We've figured it out. We figured out who the good people are and what the good stances on issues are. Knowing how to check and counteract our biases. Maybe we recognize that we're biased, but we don't really know how. When we interact with people, we don't know how to keep our biases, uh, you know, under wraps or checked whenever we're having any sort of political discussion. Um, and then of course there's people that know they're biased, but they don't really they don't really want to keep them in check. They just want to put forth their opinion and beat you over the head with it. And then recognizing why other people have the biases they do. We all have life experiences that greatly influence why we think the way we think. We can it's good to try to be as independent in your thinking as possible. But some people think they are completely independent in their thinking, and that's just not how us human beings are. There's something that's influencing our opinion. We cannot be 100% independent in our thinking because there's something that's influencing us to think a certain way. Now, we should certainly strive to be as independent as possible in our thinking, but you can never quite get to 100%. And so confirmation bias in particular is one of the biggest issues when it comes to political discourse. It's arguably one of the most oft-cited psychological phenomena there is. We seek out info that confirms what we already believe, and we dismiss info that doesn't comport with it. Or at the very least, we're much more skeptical and critical of info that we don't agree with, or if it comes from somewhere else that we typically don't support. We think either it's a bunch of crap, or we assume that it's faulty in some way. Whereas if it's from a trusted source, yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. They figured it out, so I'm just going to inherently trust them. Uh, but there's a whole bunch of different kinds of biases, and the ones I'm talking about mostly are those that clearly favor an individual, group, party, side of an issue, so on and so forth. And these are the ones I explicitly try to avoid. But there are still other important biases to be careful of. Biases come in all sorts of different types, and some are more obvious than others. A few examples is the wording in polling questions. It's so critical that when polling is done, that they are worded a very specific way, because even if you change just one term, it can completely change the answer to a polling question. For example, if I were to ask somebody what their thoughts are on welfare versus government aid, basically the same thing, but welfare has a negative connotation to it, whereas government aid is a more positive connotation. So you really got to be careful as to how you say those things. And then, in a similar manner, there are certain words that clearly indicate a writer's political persuasion. If we talk about immigration, which is obviously a very hot topic right now, if I were a reporter, a journalist, or some sort of pundit, and you heard me say the words illegal immigrants, or you heard me say undocumented migrants, you probably know where I'm coming from. If I said illegal immigrants, I'm probably coming from a conservative point of view. If I say undocumented migrants, I'm probably coming from a liberal point of view because of just the way these groups, these sides have framed an issue. So you got to be careful with how they're framing an issue. And they're not necessarily wrong terms to use, but they're just co-opted to the point where certain people who use them, you know which side of the aisle they're coming from, so they sort of activate a certain kind of bias. Another one, which is a little less obvious, is and the thing about bias is it doesn't have to be partisan or ideological or issue based in nature. It could be devoid of any of those kinds of things, but it can still something can still be biased in a way to maybe favor another side. So if I assign a value judgment to a number, if I say 50% of something, is that a significant proportion? Is 30% a significant proportion? Is 20%? Does our view of that number being significant change depending on the context? Like if I said 30% of people supported this candidate for, I don't know, governor, is that a significant proportion? Now, what if I said 30% of uh, people voted for this candidate for president? Now, is that more significant? I had another example that I was going to use, but now I forgot what it was. But in any case, technically, calling that a significant proportion is a bias. It's trying to it sort of intimates what I think about a given topic. Like if I said 30% of people voted for this governor, if I said a significant proportion, 30% of people voted for this candidate for governor, that's going to prime you to think, oh wow, that is a lot. Now if I just straight up said 30% of people voted for this candidate for governor, maybe you'll still think that's a significant proportion, but you also might not. And then if you compare it to, but 70% voted for this other person, well, maybe the 30% doesn't seem so significant. So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing that you said that was significant or something. It's not like it's not the worst bias that you could come up with, but it is a sort of bias. There's also counteract bias. So that's basically talking about something tangentially related to a topic, but really isn't relevant to a situation being talked about. Like if I talk about two candidates running for, I don't know, state legislature, state house representatives, and candidate A and candidate B, here's what they think about these five specific issues. And then I bring up at the end that one of them had a DUI. That's a counteract bias. It's not necessarily that it's not important, but it's not really relevant to the particular topic. We were just talking about their views on political issues, and then I brought up a personal transgression that one of them had. It's again, it still is an important consideration, but it's not important to the particular topic at hand. So again, doesn't have to be inherently partisan or ideological or issue based. You can just another way is you can just think you know more about how something in politics works, like a type of election, election history, so on and so forth, than you actually do. That's a type of bias, and it happens to all of us. I whenever I research things, whether for this podcast or for something else, I'll sometimes uh, go back into it to see. No, let me just make sure that I've got something correct, and then I'll find out something completely new. Like, oh, interesting! I didn't know there was that little wrinkle to things. So again, that's technically a type of bias, but not necessarily favoring one side. You just think you've got something more figured out than you actually did. And these biases, the more sinister biases, they can lead to knee-jerk reactions to what we hear and read. So, how does this issue get exploited by the exploiters? Well, exploiters, they feed off of voters' anger, fear, disgust, hatred, distrust, and that these biases activate. If I'm a Republican, I'm probably going to find Democrats, or I'm going to probably be biased towards against Democrats. If I'm a Democrat, I'm probably going to be biased against Republicans. Biased info is much more prevalent and in your face than the non-biased info is. And again, I'm not going to name specific outlets, but there's a lot of media outlets out there that favor left, right, middle, whatever, and they are clearly biased towards their group, their party, their candidate, who, whatever the case may be, something that they support or something that they favor or someone that they favor is going to be probably propped up more on that outlet. And then people not associated with that uh, point of view probably going to be knocked down a few pegs. If you're predisposed toward or against a party, individual, ideology, group, etc., exploiters can pander to these views, especially if you A, don't realize that you're biased, or B, you realize that you're biased, but you don't really care, and you're just going to keep on being that way because it's your point of view. Uh, People who don't think that they are biased or put less effort into checking these biases, they are particularly susceptible to exploiters that get these knee-jerk reactions, or like the counteract bias I talked about. If I'm trying to be, even if it's somebody that has a vested interest in who wins an election, but they talk about the candidate's issues, and then the one that they don't like, they bring up that DUI or some other personal transgression, their infidelity, for example. They're probably trying to get a certain reaction out of you. And then if you are biased towards that candidate, you might make excuses for that personal transgression instead, or say, oh, that's not important though. What's important is what they think about the issues. But if the sides were flipped and it was the other candidate that had the DUI or cheating scandal, then the other side would be talking about how this is not important to the political discussion, or they just completely disregard it. And then the other side is talking about how this is not somebody that is fit for office. But more than, maybe not more than anything, but one of the biggest issues when it comes to biases is that there's a disturbing inability for many people to differentiate between fact and opinion, not just fact from fiction. Yes, we do have a serious problem with misinformation and disinformation, but just the fact that people can't differentiate between fact and opinion. In a 2024 study from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, 45.7% of respondents performed no better than a coin flip at the task of differentiating fact from opinion. That's a problem. People oftentimes like to peddle their opinion as fact, or they say the other side doesn't have the facts, they just have opinions. And even then that might be a little bit generous if they don't outright say they're just saying falsehoods. So these biases are one of the biggest reasons that exploiters can, well, exploit knowledge gaps. Another way that these exploiters try to take advantage of people is the rise of artificial intelligence, AI is unfortunately going to become increasingly tied to our lives. And now it still has a ways to go. I mean, there's countless examples where AI was wrong about information. If I search for something on ChatGPT or Grok or uh, Gemini or pick any AI, and they have information that's just flat out wrong. It makes weird images that are clearly AI. I remember seeing one AI graphic that was trying to make two football teams across from each other, and one side of uh, the the field there were two guys on the line of scrimmage that had footballs. It's like there's only one football, and it was just an interesting uh, image that AI came up with. Is like that's not what happens in a football game. But uh, you get other ones too, like maybe a human's hand has 6 fingers instead of 5. Uh, AI, if you use AI to voice over something, a lot of times it clearly sounds robotic. It's obvious that you did AI. So it still has a long ways to go, but it still has some startling capabilities already. It's it's cutting out a lot of people's jobs. They create deep fakes. When deep fakes aren't a new thing, but they are becoming worse and worse. And there's been uh, federal and state level uh, legislation that has tried to tackle deepfakes, especially when it comes to things like revenge porn. Uh, uh, AI has made algorithms more powerful. One of my biggest pet peeves right now is the general trend of really hate when companies are trying hard to personify their AI and make it seem like, oh, this is just basically it's your buddy, or and create an avatar for it so it looks like a person. Obviously, that's the point, so that you become that you're more likely to use that AI and you're not as apprehensive about it. But it still it drives me crazy. There's a lot of things that drive me crazy though. So I mean, I don't know how much that's saying, but uh, and to some extent, these internet and social media algorithms were a precursor to the capabilities of AI today. Uh, these algorithms that pander to what you want to see, taking your personal data to try to figure out what kind of things you like and showing you these kinds of things that you want to see, creating information silos, especially when it comes to politics. So, how does this issue get exploited by the exploiters? Well, just said a few of those things, but citizens are sometimes, it may sound weird, but a lot of citizens are still way too trusting of what AI tells them. When we research info, there's younger people often over rely on AI in schoolwork and assume what they are getting is good info. They'll sometimes just copy and paste what ChatGPT or whatever tells them and then just put it on their paper thinking that they're not going to get caught. I mean, you are. Believe me, I was around when, plagiarism detection was getting better and better, and believe me, those things will catch you. I did not get make clear I did not plagiarize anything, but heard plenty of stories about other people plagiarizing things, and you'll get caught. Older people, like with phone scams and internet scams, they can be too trusting because they're not as tech savvy. But people of all ages, regardless of possible apprehension about AI, they might take the AI at face value, even if it supposedly cites sources. Like if you go on Google where it has those AI uh, summaries of something you're searching, they still have sources, so you should go in those and make sure that information you're getting is good. But exploiters are taking AI to a whole new level by getting better at creating those deep fakes that cater to people's biases. If I don't like a candidate, it's getting way easier to create a fake image or a fake video of that candidate saying something completely abhorrent, uh, but it's not something that they actually said. And again, that kind of technology has been around for a while, but it's getting better and better, and it's starting to become indistinguishable from reality. Uh, So AI is increasing its capabilities, and you might have more and more political groups and individuals have their own AI that tries to tell you uh, false information or at least disinformation about their candidacy or the candidacy for opponents. So with AI becoming a greater and greater part of society in general, it's going to become a greater part of politics in general. So we really need to be careful about what exactly it's telling us. Don't let it completely supplant and replace the need for critical thinking skills, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But before we get to that part, let's talk about the fragmentation of mass media and competing for consumers' attention. So, in the early days of TV specifically, actually, you know what? Let's go back to really early days of media in the U.S., where you had newspapers. A lot of people like to talk about how news used to be so unbiased and it only told you the facts. Like, no, even in the earliest days of US media, you had newspapers that clearly favored one side or another. So you still had those biases that now journalistic standards had obviously evolved since those early days. But uh, we fast forward to the early days of TV. Obviously, TVs were not as ubiquitous as they are now, but you only had a few channels. You had NBC, CBS, ABC. All three of those are still around. And then you had the now defunct Dumont. Uh, so if you wanted to watch TV, those were the only games in town. You had to go straight to those. And so there were far fewer programs. And if you wanted to, it's like the Tonight Show with, excuse me, the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. He was really the only, at the time, he was really the only uh, late night television host. That was now there's a lot more late night TV and daytime talk shows and stuff like that. But you know, American culture, media culture was a lot more unified in the sense that the vast majority of TV viewers were watching the same things, like mostly the same news channels with guys like Walter Cronkite, Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Uh, Sporting events that were on TV. There's really nowhere to go. Uh, but it, you inherently were exposed to more varied content, even though there was only a few television channels, because more because there were so few TV channels, people all had to kind of watch the same channels, and so you had a lot more different kinds of people watching something, so you got a lot more varied content. It wasn't so fragmented information silos. But especially over the past 30 to 40 years, the number of media outlets has exploded. It's gone up exponentially. And that's not just in politics. Hundreds and hundreds of TV channels about everything under the sun. And then you've got YouTube, you've got radio, you've got newspapers and magazines. Uh, People who don't want politics at all can easily find non-politics content and mostly stick to it. When they go on social media, it's a little bit hard, a little bit more difficult to completely avoid. But now these channels can be a lot more catered to a specific audience. Doesn't have to have such varied content. It can just focus on that content that those viewers of that TV channel or listeners to that radio station or viewers of a YouTube channel or social media account in general, they don't have to be so varied in their content anymore. So people who want a specific worldview to pander to them, they can easily find something on any of those media, any of those types of media and specific channels on those media. Uh, And this can be especially challenging to deal with if you have a wide variety of interests. Uh, Example, I obviously I'm involved in politics for a living, but I also am a big sports fan and fan of video games. And there's other stuff like history that I enjoy as well. But a lot of these channels are fragmented, and I have to go to different places to get them. And there's just the sheer amount of information that's out there. It's just overloading people's brains, and it can be hard to. There's just too much stuff to consume, and you're not going to be able to consume all of it. So it's very easy to just completely separate yourself from politics, for example. So the fragmentation of mass media and competing for consumers' attention. How does this issue get exploited? The thing that we really need to recognize is it's easy to just blame media, and there's a lot of issues with media, but media and media consumers, us, and the nature of the mass market have also contributed to the problem. I want to focus on contribution, not blame, uh, because contribution focuses more on how can we all get better. But many biased media outlets, they deliberately cover stories in a way that will generate clicks and views, especially in our clout obsessed society, especially when you have all these influencers. Starting to sound like an old fart at this point, uh, saying that kind of thing. But I mean, it's I personally find it really ridiculous how many influencers, quote unquote, that there are, especially when it comes to politics. But media consumers, they flock to their information silos. They don't venture outside of it, and the media caters accordingly. And the market incentivizes outlets so that in order for them to survive, they need to overly cater and pander to their segment of the consumer population. If you try to branch out too much, you're it's going to be hard for you to appeal to enough people in the population to keep yourself afloat economically. Uh, there's also the fact that the polarizing, not insightful, but inciting content gets much more circulation, both by the people who the content panders to and the people who hate it. The people who hate it still engage with it and share it to say, look how stupid this is. This is terrible. This is awful. What a bunch of jerks. But you're still circulating it. You're still engaging with it. So it's getting more reach. These algorithms think, oh, more people want to see this. Uh, and therefore the polarizing content breaks through to more consumers much more often than non-polarizing content. Even though we have these information silos, these really polarizing things can break out of those and reach more people just because more and more people who both love it and hate it are engaging with it. Despite what we say about wanting less negativity in our media, wanting less negative political campaigning, it is the thing that we respond to most. We respond to stories about conflict in general more than the stories about cooperation or something heartwarming. I'm not saying that we don't like that stuff, because we do, but we respond a lot more emphatically to the stuff that gets a rise out of people in some way. So exploiters can craft information silos like never before, and a large chunk of the population will flock to them. And there's, again, I don't want to name specific ones, but there are, for your particular political group, for your particular political segment, there's going to be a channel made just for you. And politicians and interest groups, uh, especially ones that are, I would consider, or we would consider, exploiters, mostly just go to a like-minded channel to reach their audience that is predisposed to agree with them. And if somebody only, and for the people who typically don't pay attention to politics, they only pay attention around election time because they just don't want to deal with politics, but they at least feel like they need to be involved in some way, or they don't feel like it's important for them to pay attention to until election time. They're just consuming other media at all other times. Exploiters tend to get their content in those consumers' faces first. So a lot of these people who don't pay attention to politics can get a skewed view of what's going on. Not necessarily that it's wrong, but it is going to be biased. Might be wrong, but in any case, it's going to be biased. So their little bit of interaction with politics might get the exploiting content instead. The next way that exploiters can exploit knowledge gaps is because of the complexities of the political process. Politics is extremely complicated. Even if we want to think that we know more about it than we actually do, there are so many political issues of the day with so many nuances. You just look at the as some people call it, big beautiful bill in Congress right now. It's over 1,000 pages. I think it's 1,116. And I mean, there have been other bills that have been that long, if not, and even longer than that. But there's so many issues just packed in that bill. And each one of them has a lot of nuance to it, even though a lot of people want to act like these issues are clear cut. This is the way that you should think about this issue. You either support this thing or you don't support this thing. Not regarding like, okay, I like little bits of this, but not so much other parts of it. So many elected and appointed officials that have both a lot of the more public facing ones, the more obvious uh, uh, elected and appointed officials, and then ones that are a little more esoteric that people don't know about. And then, regardless of whether they're well known or not, a lot of these officials have a lot of public facing tasks and a lot of more esoteric tasks. There's so much interweaving of governmental duties, impacts of policies from multiple government officials at the federal, state, and local levels. So, if I want to talk about the policies of various elected officials, maybe I think, oh, the president, this policy that the president has supported has led to a ton of terrible things, a lot of issues, or something that the president didn't support, which would have fixed a lot of issues. This thing now, or like if we're talking about unemployment, if we want to blame the president, obviously right now it's Donald Trump, but you can say the same thing for Joe Biden and Barack Obama and George Bush and whoever. We talk about, oh, well, this policy has been terrible for the unemployment rate. It's making it go up. Well, what if you're in a particular state that is having an issue with the unemployment rate? Is it necessarily the president's fault, or maybe it's the governor of your state who had a policy that affected you, or maybe it's a county commissioner or county commission that had a bad policy, for example. So sometimes it can be very difficult to figure out, putting aside any particular biases we have about elected officials, to just put those to the side for a second. You might not know which of these officials was actually, which of their policies was what directly led to that issue with the unemployment rate or lower wages. There's too many of them interweaving. I'm not saying that you can't blame any one of them or think any of their policies are bad, but there's just so many different officials that have that you're in the jurisdiction of, and they're doing all sorts of things that it can be hard to parse through and see which one of these are actually the ones that are responsible. But we can make it seem simpler than it actually is. And so there's different reactions that people have to and voters have to things when they get super complex. Some people will try to simplify things by going to trusted sources to tell them info. We all, because everything is so complicated, we all try to find ways to simplify things in our head. And the way that some people do it is just go, okay, you know what? People that I tend to agree with, I'm just going to let them tell me how something is. Some people, when they encounter a large amount of complexity, they try to understand what's going on, but then they just get bogged down. And some people just tune out politics altogether. It's like, you know what? I'm not going to deal with it. I'm just not going to listen. And so, how does this issue get exploited? Again, as a sort of defense mechanism against complex issues, we try to simplify things in our head, a lot of times oversimplify things. It takes less time and effort, which we have limited quantities of, and exploiters take advantage of that natural tendency by making issues seem simpler than they actually are. Oh, this policy by so and so is a terrible policy because X, Y, and Z. This person's policy is great because of X, Y, and Z. There's probably a little bit more to it than that, especially if it's a really broad type of policy, like when it comes to, if we want to use guns as an example, okay? It's not just a simple, do you want more gun control or do you want less gun control? It's, okay, what age does the gun carrier need to have? And even if if do we make it 18 or 21? Even if they're not 21, do we give them a chance to fill out a waiver as a sort of special case where they get to have a gun? Do they need to have background checks? Do they need to have concealed carry lessons? Do they have to have a concealed carry permit at all? Bump stocks, limitations on how much ammo they buy, specific guns they can buy. It's not just simply, oh, we need more gun control, or we need less gun control. There's a lot more to it than that. And the amount of complexity leads of these political issues and these and the way that government works, it leads some registered voters to just sit out of elections because they do not feel educated enough. And so the polarized voters and the exploiters have an inordinate amount of influence because they're the ones that are already participating at higher rates. And voters that are the more exploited ones, the more polarized ones, participate at higher rates. So they're going to be participating at even higher rates than the less polarized, possibly less exploited people. So you still have exploiters having an inordinate amount of power because more of their like-minded individuals are participating in the electoral process. And then the last topic I want to focus on for how knowledge gaps get exploited is the inability and or lack of time to research issues. So just about everybody knows the importance of research. Maybe some people don't think it's that important, but most people know you should research things. But it's a whole other thing to know how to research and to know whether you are researched. Because research takes time, it takes effort, and it might take money if you need to access a certain resource but they make you subscribe to something. You might need some money, but in any case, research takes time and effort. Taking time that you could be doing something else and applying it to researching an issue or candidates. Those of us who are involved in politics don't always appreciate the fact that regular people aren't necessarily taught how to find info, or they don't have the time. And even those of us who are involved in politics for a living have these issues, and we all can improve on our research skills. I find new resources every day. They're like, oh wow, I wish I knew about this thing. I'm gonna use it. There's also the fact that critical thinking skills have had less emphasis placed on them in schooling. Uh, even people who don't even know, like, okay, I need to evaluate who this information is coming from. I need to evaluate how it stacks up to previous information. I need to figure out if it's a study, like, okay, is this funded by somebody who has a particular point of view? Because some scientific studies, even if they are generally sound in how they're structured, they could still be commissioned at the behest of somebody who has a vested interest in a political outcome, and they might be exploiters themselves, or the researcher doesn't account for their own biases when it comes to an issue. Even people who profess their belief in the need for critical thinking often falter in this regard, and or they don't actually believe in the need for critical thinking. They only believe in the need for critical thinking if it's a somebody on the other side of the aisle, because they haven't critically thought about things, because if they did, they'd agree with me. or they want to shove some sort of opinion down people's throats, or they want to prevent another opinion from being uh, talked about. And then similarly, media literacy and the state of American civics has also taken a major dip. Media literacy, people take something at face value and don't really think about any context beyond that. Uh, American civics in general, I mean, you see studies all the time about how many people can name even one U.S. Supreme Court justice, or name the three branches of government. And it's a startlingly low percentage of people who can do those things, even the things that people would typically consider basic knowledge about the political system of the system of government that we have in this country. Um, there are great resources such as Ballotpedia, who full disclosure, I used to work for, that are gaining more and more traction. Ballotpedia is the encyclopedia of American politics, and it has just thousands and thousands and thousands of pages about candidates, about election results, about about specific political concepts, and they serve as the source for some of my material that I have on this podcast. But even though they've become a lot more popular, there's still a lot of people that don't know about them, or things like Pew Research Center, for example. Although they're mostly public opinion data. Uh, who's another good example I'm trying to think of? Um, National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL. They have a ton of info about state legislatures and how they all work and how they're similar and they differ. All these kinds of resources, but people don't necessarily know about them. So, how does this issue about the lack of the time or the inability to research issues, how does that get exploited by the exploiters? Well, exploiters make their heavily biased info easy for people to find. And we just talked about how the polarizing, exploiting content tends to have more reach than the content that is not exploiting. There, so because that kind of info, the exploiting info, spreads like wildfire, exploiters have a lot easier time making their heavily biased info easy for people to find. So when people are trying to research and their research skills are not up to par, or they don't really have the time to research, they're probably going to come across that information first. But unfortunately, quality and unbiased, or at least significantly less biased content takes more effort and time to find. Again, time and effort, finite resources that we have. And then if you include money in the equation, that's definitely finite for most of us. But because research uses so much of our personal resources, it can be very easy to put it off, especially if you have a procrastination gene. So if you're trying to research the candidates in an election, you might be taking a long time to try to sift through information, and it'd be very easy to just throw your hands up and not deal with it, or to simply say, you know what, I'm just going to rely on my biases. You're not necessarily going to say that specifically, but it's easier to rely on our biases and mental shortcuts, what we call heuristics, uh, which exploiters use to their advantage. So if I'm trying to find information about this candidate, okay, what do I typically think of Republicans? What do I typically think about Democrats? What do I typically think about liberals and conservatives? You use those heuristics to come to a certain conclusion, and exploiters use that to their advantage, whether they're trying to get you to support their candidates, like, look at this conservative warrior, look at this liberal champion over here, or they say, or they use those heuristics to denigrate that person. Look at this conservative nut job. Look at this liberal wacko. And it's a lot easier to just rely on that and say, okay, I'm just not going to vote for that person. I'm not even going to look for their information. Now some of these candidates don't do a good job about making their information available either. They might have a really terrible website, and they might not have a website at all about them. And then some of that though is, they have very limited money to make themselves known, but that's a whole other issue. But these exploiters then become the gatekeepers of info, especially as that information becomes more and more prevalent. It's harder and harder to sift through it to try to get through it all. So we have a very serious issue with when it comes to exploiting knowledge gaps. It happens more and more, and every one of us at some point in time is susceptible to it because we're human beings. We have our own biases. Every one of us believes in something that is not correct, and ideally you eventually come up with more information and say, okay, I'm going to change what I think about this thing now. And again, bias isn't necessarily a wrong point of view, but it's an opinion about something. So you need to stop peddling that kind of thing as fact. So it's one of these very serious issues that is one of my biggest gripes, is this whole exploiting of knowledge gaps. I have a very strong distaste for when people try to take advantage of a system in a way that uh, is in a way that they should not be taking advantage of it. That is using people and thought processes to their own advantage. Now, how, of course, people might have a different opinion. That's not exploiting. I'm just trying to win this election and trying to enact the things that I believe. But as a general concept, when it comes to exploiting people, again, maybe we have differing views on who's doing the exploiting, but it is something that is becoming more and more prevalent, and they're doing it through these ways like activating our biases, which are becoming easier and easier to figure out with the amount of uh, information that we have on people, the rise of artificial intelligence, how mass media is fragmented into these information silos, how complex the political process is, and this lack of researching ability that just hasn't really been taught well lately. Just a lot of these issues are uh, becoming worse and worse, and hopefully can do whatever I can to try to reverse that trend, and a lot more people do the same thing. There are things that we really need to address, and since this is running long, I'm going to save that for the next episode to talk about some of the ways we can start counteracting some of these knowledge gap exploits. And obviously, that's a lot easier said than done. I'm going to try to give something a little bit more tangible than, oh, well, we need to stop doing this, because that's not really helping anybody. But that is going to do it for today's podcast. So thank you, as always, for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, share with everybody you know. Even if they try to exploit knowledge gaps, maybe they can look at this and say, oh, you know what? Maybe that's not how I should do things. I don't know. That might just be idealistic. But in any case, please just share with anybody that you know. And links in the show notes, my Facebook page, my LinkedIn profile, medium.com, my educational email course about how to depolarize the political climate, or mistakes that we make when trying to depolarize the political climate and how we can fix those mistakes. My book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive, available on Amazon in ebook and paperback format, and a couple other things in there as well. But again, always, thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. And until next time, take care.